Look, I'm not saying it was the Wendigo. However, the wildlands of America can be indescribably beautiful, and the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness of Minnesota is no exception. Located in the far northern extreme of the land of 10,000 lakes, the 1 million acres of federally protected land make up a significant portion of Superior National Forest along the state's border with Ontario, Canada. A popular recreational destination with over 1,200 miles of canoe routes and well over 2,000 campsites, the Boundary Waters attract around 150,000 people per year, with mishaps or disappearances being relatively rare. And on the infrequent occasion that something does happen, rescue squads and law enforcement are rarely at a loss to explain the incident. Most often, tragedy can be attributed to the decisions made by the person affected, but every now and then, investigators are left scratching their heads. Such was the case with 29-year-old Jordan Grider, a modern-day nomad who in 2018 attempted to spend winter in a primitive camp in the wilderness area. Jordan wasn't new to this lifestyle, having lived out of his truck and in these makeshift encampments since his late teens. But being a boy from New Mexico, one thing to which he was definitely not accustomed was winter in the Great Lakes region. For that reason, investigators were not entirely surprised when they became aware that something had happened to Jordan during his attempt to weather out the season. The confusing part was determining precisely what it was that had happened, because none of the evidence really seemed to add up. It took months to find Jordan's campsite, and then, even once it was discovered, it only led to more questions than answers. Items were strewn about the area in ways that just didn't really make sense, and yet Jordan was nowhere to be found. There was evidence of a violent end, but no sign of a struggle. It seemed that no matter where investigators turned, something stood in the way of a coherent explanation. As often happens in unsolved cases like this, in particular those that occur outside the perceived comfort and safety of human settlements, the superstitious among us quickly jump to explain the events through paranormal or preternatural means. The incident came to my attention through Nick over at The Missing Enigma, to whom I am very grateful for sharing the documents that he obtained via FOIA so that we could take a look at this case as well. Nick has a fantastic video of his own on this case with a title that really catches the eye. Killed by a Sasquatch? The Disappearance and Death of Jordan Grider. When Nick first mentioned it to me, and then when I saw the listing for the video, I was actually a little surprised. Like me, Nick is pretty cautious about assigning supernatural causes to peculiar missing persons cases. I don't want to speak for the guy, but through the conversations we've had, I've been under the impression that he's more of a skeptic than I am, though by no means closed off to the possibility of things beyond our knowledge and understanding. For that reason, I was very interested to see what warranted a title like that from a researcher like him. After diving into it, I absolutely get it. Although I cannot say that I think Sasquatch is necessarily the kind of thing responsible for this. But in order to understand why it is that I'm open to a less than mundane explanation for these events, and before we get into the details of Jordan's disappearance and the subsequent investigation into his demise, a little bit of history is needed for contextual purposes. Now, if you aren't interested in that, and you just want to get right into the story, then you can just go ahead and skip to the next chapter of this video. For those who do want the background, however, let's briefly discuss Minnesota. Since the time of European settlement in North America, there have been two distinct Native American groups associated with this region. In the western and southern portions of the state were the Siouan-speaking tribes of the eastern Dakota, while Algonquian speakers of the Anishinaabe cultural group were present in the north and east nearby to the Lake Superior. Lake Superior, not the Lake Superior. I've grown up going to the Great Lakes. Of the two groups, the tribes of the Anishinaabe were most likely the more recent arrivals, having migrated into the region around 1,000 years ago. We've talked on a few occasions about the Anishinaabe and their migration story and their prophecy of the Seven Fires, but today I want to focus more on what became of the people who underwent that journey. The term Anishinaabe itself has been defined by scholars like Basil H. Johnston, himself a member of the Ojibwe Nation, as the good beings, which he writes is understood as meaning that human beings derive their goodness from their intent, because generally, men and women tend to do what ought to be done and what is of benefit. Within this cultural umbrella, there are several different tribal groups, the largest of which is the Ojibwe, and they are closely related to the Potawatomi and the Ottawa. Together, these three form the Council of Three Fires, which is an intertribal alliance in which each tribe plays a unique and specific role. The unity and structure of this alliance is traditionally held to be the result of decisions made along that great migratory journey that brought the Anishinaabe out of the Dawnlands, which are typically today associated with New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and parts of Maine. Those who went on different paths along the way became the other main tribal identities of this group, those being the Algonquin, the Nipissing, and the Mississaugas, all of whom inhabited portions of eastern Ontario and western Quebec, north of Lakes Ontario and Erie. The reason that this is relevant, and something that I'll go into more detail about after we cover the details of Grider's disappearance, is their folklore about one specific entity. Something that, in the absence of other explanations, may be the one thing that ties together the mystery of what happened to Jordan Grider one fateful night in October of 2018. Something called the Wendigo. Now, if you know anything about the Wendigo, you know that it's probably all centered around hunger. And if the Wendigo had just one thing, maybe he wouldn't be so angry. Magic spoon. You know, if the Wendigo weren't so obsessed with the things that it was accustomed to eating and would prefer to try something a little bit better, it could get the high protein, no sugar, carb conscious lifestyle that comes with Magic Spoon. I mean, you may also know that the Wendigo is kind of known for being really scrawny, really skeletal. But if it were to get those 13 to 14 grams of protein with 0 grams of sugar and 4 to 5 grams of net carbs in each serving, then it could feel good about what it's eating. And you know, I'm not a Wendigo, but what I like about Magic Spoon is how it just brings me back to childhood. You know, sitting there on a Saturday morning, eating cereal while I watched my cartoons. These days, it's really more of a snack for when I'm up late working and actually doing the research on all of these videos. You can even hear it clinking into the bowl. Because like an adult, I eat my cereal without milk. It's certainly not that, you know, I forgot to bring milk with me to the studio. Now, if you're like me, then the hardest thing about cereal has probably been that it's really hard to eat while hiking out in the woods. But with Magic Spoon treats, that's no longer a problem. Magic Spoon treats are packed with 11 to 12 grams of protein with only 1 gram of sugar and 1 to 2 net carbs. So it's kind of the perfect cereal substitute for when you're in a place that's milkless, like, you know, the Appalachian Trail. If you'd like to give Magic Spoon a try, then you can head to the link in the description or use code LORELodge on their website to get $5 off. You can also find Magic Spoon on Amazon or at your nearest grocery store. And since Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it is backed by a 100% happiness guarantee online. So if you don't like it for any reason, you can get your money back. So if you want to give it a try, head to the link in the description or go to magicspoon.com/LoreLodge to get $5 off your order. I no longer have the hunger. Good. It was early October 2018 when U.S. Forest Service agent Kevin Sheffer spotted a white Chevy 2500 parked on a road next to the Sioux Hustler Trail in the Boundary Waters Canoe area wilderness of northern Minnesota. The pickup, a 1995 model with New Mexico plates registered to 29-year-old Jordan Grider, was sitting in front of a gate and blocking access to a private road labeled on maps as Devil Cascade, where several private cabins are located several miles into the woods. As for its driver, there was no sign of him. Unable to find contact information or locate the owner of the vehicle, Agent Sheffer had it towed to the Sioux Hustler Trailhead parking lot just a few yards away, at which point he managed to contact Grider's family. The Griders informed Agent Sheffer that Jordan will leave for weeks at a time and go live out in the woods, a habit that he'd adopted approximately a decade prior. Speaking to the Duluth News-Tribune, Jordan's mother, Rebecca Grider, said that her son had a very strong independent streak. The third eldest of 6 brothers, he wasn't exactly the black sheep of the family, but he was certainly its least conventional member. Author Joe Friedrich wrote in his 2024 book Last Entry Point that, according to Jordan's mother, he was athletic and curious but never learned to read or write beyond an elementary grade level due to severe dyslexia which went undiagnosed until the time that he was 12. Friedrichs further wrote that, over time, his learning disability and lack of education manifested in his unruly engagement with the world. While the author doesn't go into specifics, it seems that Jordan's parents revealed some issues not mentioned in news or police reports, particularly run-ins with the law and a tendency to slip into the dark shadows of society or to abandon it altogether. His struggles eventually led him into a nomadic lifestyle where he could be free from the burdens of rent, landlords, and utility bills arriving in the mail. He spent several years in upstate New York and then another stretch in rural Kentucky, braving all seasons in his hammock and tent. Minnesota, on the other hand, was a different challenge altogether. While the coldest part of New York, that being the Adirondack region, averages highs in the 30s through January, the Boundary Waters sit firmly in the teens. But for this trip, he told his mother that he wanted to be near the water, and there is certainly plenty of that in the Boundary Waters. Covering over 1 million acres of Superior National Forest, the wilderness area is dotted with over 1,100 lakes ranging in size between 10 and 100 acres, with innumerable smaller bodies of waters like ponds and streams. Aside from the water, it's basically all forest, which is great for recreational activities like hunting, fishing, canoeing, hiking, and camping, but not much else. And as a result, much of the region is very isolated. The specific location where Jordan's pickup was found, the Sioux Hustler Trailhead, is over 11 miles from the nearest human settlement, which is Big Lake Wilderness Lodge. Not even really a town or a village, it's a wilderness resort. The nearest community is Crane Lake, which is a little fishing and resort village that's classified as an unincorporated community about 24 miles northwest of the trail, while the nearest real town is Eli, or Ellie, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, which is another 33 miles to the southeast. However, this didn't seem to bother Jordan. If anything, the isolation seems to have been precisely what he wanted. While back in New Mexico for his birthday, as well as several other family events in September of 2018, he told his parents and brothers what he planned to do, and they weren't exactly on board. "We wanted him to wait until spring," Rebecca Grider told Joe Friedrichs. "We didn't like the idea of a winter in the woods in Minnesota. Nobody did, other than Jordan." To the young nomad, this was simply the next adventure, and he must have felt ready for it, because his mother told the News Tribune that her son was super cautious and he would be super daring too, but only if he had mastered what he was going to be daring with. So, while his family's concerns were certainly valid, Grider seemed content with his situation. According to police documents obtained by Nick over at the Missing Enigma, Jordan texted the family group chat on October 8, 2018, sending a picture of a beaver pond not far from his campsite, and then again on the 9th with an accounting of how much grain and beans he'd bought for his stay. It was the last they'd ever hear from him. Based on the accessible documentation, it's unclear exactly what happened in October of 2018. Police reports mention that a welfare check was called in for Jordan Grider on the 22nd, but who made the request is not listed. It's possible that it was Agent Sheffer, but it's much more likely that it was Grider's family. Either way, authorities were unable to track down the campsite even after being provided a copy of the picture that Jordan sent to his family. In fact, it would take nearly 6 months for any evidence of Jordan's whereabouts to turn up in the form of a baseball hat that was found near the campsite in either late March or early April of 2019. Not long after that, on April 5th, 2019, a Lieutenant Patton of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources informed the St. Louis County Sheriff's Office that several agents and officers had located a campsite in the Boundary Waters. Believing it belonged to Jordan Grider, Lieutenant Patton requested the assistance of the Sheriff's Office in processing the scene. The department dispatched Deputy Brandon Kucharski and investigators Steve Heinrich and Chad Larson to the trailhead, where they met Minnesota Conservation Officer Sean Williams, as well as Border Patrol Agent Matthew Eastham, Forest Service Agent Kevin Sheffer, and members of the St. Louis County Rescue Squad. The group traveled by snowmobile, approaching the campsite from the north via a decommissioned trail. This is a little bit confusing, as maps would suggest that the decommissioned trail has an access point at the Sioux Hustler Trailhead, which is much closer to the site, but it could be that something rendered the nearer route unusable. In any case, as they approached Grider's encampment, Williams located a dark in color cloth item lying in the snow, which was identified as a shredded sleeping bag cover. Williams found the piece just north of the site, approximately halfway between the camp and the crest of the hill. The hill in question is small, the top sitting at 1,383 feet above sea level as compared to the campsite at 1,364 feet, making a difference of only about 20 feet or 6 meters. It did seem that this position was chosen strategically. Officer Williams would go on to tell the Duluth News-Tribune that he'd have wanted the same cover from the north wind had he been winter camping. He further explained that it was in a super remote place and that if you were looking for a spot to avoid contact with people, he really did find it. That opinion, however, does not seem to have been entirely consistent among investigators. Rick Slatton, St. Louis County Rescue Squad captain, speaking to Joe Friedrichs for Last Entry Point, pointed out that as the crow flies, Grider was less than a mile from a pretty main road, being only 4,500 feet into the woods from Echo Trail. In his opinion, that's not very remote when it comes to the Boundary Waters. Perhaps the best compromise is to say that while it's not that far from a main road, it's certainly not somewhere where people would be traveling frequently. That contributed to the length of time that it took to find the campsite, but also made the circumstances of what was found there quite odd. Upon arrival, investigators found a green tarp slung over a guy line between two trees, functioning as a makeshift tent. Inside was a hammock, sleeping bag, and mat, and a number of other bags and miscellaneous items. After photographing the scene, investigator Heinrich wrote that he had other officers cut the tarp down the middle, at which point both halves were then laid on the ground and photographed. At the time that the campsite was first discovered, on April 5, 2019, there were reportedly 2 to 4 feet of snow on the ground, and they were able to determine that the sleeping bag cover had likely been there prior to the winter because there was grass underneath it rather than snow. In addition, Williams had recovered a shredded jacket on the south side of the campsite, and investigator Heinrich's report listed another 8 items recovered from the scene that day. These included a baggie containing toilet paper and a cloth bag, a Beretta 92FS 9mm handgun with 12 rounds of ammunition in the magazine, a sketchbook with handwritten notes, a GoPro camera, a black wallet with $178 in cash, and a New Mexico driver's license belonging to Jordan Grider, a black stocking cap, a beanie for those of you who are more coastal, another black stocking cap said to have been found by Sheffer, previously misidentified as a baseball cap, a blue inflatable pillow, a plastic bag containing address and pens, and 2 General Motors keys on key rings. What they didn't find was Jordan Grider. Unfortunately, nothing was found that could suggest where he might have gone, but there were signs of what had happened to him. Namely, there was a lot of blood. Deputy Bacharski wrote that the hammock had large amounts of what appeared to be dried blood, while Heinrich reported that he located several areas of blood spatter on the inside of the tarp and a large amount of blood in the hammock and sleeping bag. This raised a number of questions, the chief being, if all of this blood belonged to Jordan, then where was the body? Due to the sheer amount of snow on the ground and the fact that Jordan was almost certainly deceased, it was determined by the responding officers and agents that a more complete search should be performed once the snow eventually melted. They didn't have to wait very long, the spring thaw affording them a mostly snow-free search area by the end of the month. Investigator Brian Wilson, also of the St. Louis County Sheriff's Department, wrote about his findings and those of others on the 25th of April. During the second search, they had the benefit of considerably more boots on a now snow-free ground, approximately 20 to 30 people. Rescue Captain Slatton relayed to Friedrichs that he brought a number of his own men and several cadaver dogs to assist the Sheriff, Forest Service, and Department of Natural Resources staff in processing the scene, noting that the word rescue was not part of the equation. This was a recovery effort and potentially a crime scene investigation. The renewed effort produced quite a bit more evidence than the initial search, to the tune of an additional 29 items. Items 11 through 15, as well as items 23, 28, and 30 through 32, were all listed as bones. And of those, only a few were clearly identifiable, with investigators on the scene believing 11 to be a humerus, 12 a rib, 15 and 23 femurs, 28 a vertebral segment, and 31 a forearm. If there was any doubt that Jordan had perished, it was all but snuffed out by this aspect of the discovery, and later testing of these, as well as bones found on May 11th, confirmed via DNA testing that they belonged to Jordan, or at least that they were some 600 billion times more likely to belong to Jordan than anybody else. Now, the scattered nature of the bones and the fact that most of the skeleton was missing suggested that Grider had most likely been consumed by animals, but that only answered the question of where he was. It didn't answer the question of how he died, and if anything, it may have only confused things further. While positive identification of the remains would not be made until August of 2020, investigators were pretty confident that the bones found at the campsite belonged to Jordan Grider. Nobody else was known to be in the region, he was well off the beaten path, the location matched the picture he'd sent to his family, and there were numerous identifying documents ranging from handwritten notes and receipts to official documents that made it clear that this site was Jordan's. To that end, the investigation transitioned into an effort to establish the manner of death and, if at all possible, the cause. Despite the relatively remote location, foul play was still considered a possibility, as were animal attack, suicide, or a freak accident. The evidence was scant as it was perplexing, and not all of it necessarily seemed related to Jordan's death. Receipts found at the location placed Jordan at a Dollar General in Virginia, Minnesota at 11:41 a.m. on the 9th of October 2018, and then at Zupp's Food Market in Cook about an hour later that same day. Based on that evidence, it seems he probably did some shopping in Virginia before heading north for his stop in Cook, then up US Route 53 to Orr before turning east onto Orr Bike Road, aka Minnesota Route 23. From there, he probably turned north onto Crane Lake Road, aka Minnesota 24, before making his final turn onto Echo Trail, aka Eli Bike Road. This would have taken him to the Sioux Hustler Trailhead, where his truck was eventually found. According to the Duluth News-Tribune, the last receipt belonging to Grider was from the 10th in Eli, though it's not stated where he'd been shopping or what he had bought. He probably traveled south to Eli from the trailhead or the campsite on that day, as it seems unlikely that he'd end up going north from Virginia to get to the campsite originally if his ultimate destination was Eli, 48 miles east of that town. This would suggest that he felt he didn't have enough supplies or gear for his site, and his return on that same day would imply that he felt like he'd remedied the situation, whatever that may have been. The confusing aspect here is that if he'd already reached the campsite on the 8th, the date that police reports say he texted a picture of the site to his family, then it makes little sense that he'd be back in Virginia on the 9th, especially if he left that town going north. On the other hand, it is possible that he was going to the Walmart there after selecting his campsite the day prior. If he did that though, why go to Eli on the 10th? It could be entirely irrelevant, but the timing of his initial arrival at his campsite could indicate how many people might have known that he was out there, depending on how chatty he was with cashiers. Regardless, that receipt on the 10th gave investigators a timeline on when Jordan had settled in at his campsite, as they knew he'd been there at least from that point and possibly up to 2 days earlier. The question from there was exactly how long he'd remained alive, as that could help establish what had happened. Jordan's family visited the scene in May of 2019, and Rebecca told the Duluth News-Tribune that it looked like he had burned one fire and made one meal there, and that there was no wood that had been whittled. Her son loved to whittle. And this led her to believe that something had happened not long after he arrived, if not on the very first night. This actually isn't dissimilar from the findings in another case that we've covered, that being the disappearance and death of Bart Schleier in the Reed Lakes area of the Yukon Territory in Canada. In that instance, it appeared only one fire had been lit, only one meal had been eaten, and several pieces of bloody clothing were found near Bart's gear. Investigators were never able to agree on what had actually happened to the man, with the ever-useless RCMP arguing for a bear attack, even against the conservation officers and bear experts who insisted it did not look anything like that. Similarly, in the case of Jordan Grider, one of the immediate assumptions was that he could have been attacked by wild animals. In this case, specifically wolves. While there are black bears in the area that Jordan was camping, Friends of the Boundary Waters says that there are none of the more aggressive brown bears in the area. Brown bears have been known to prey on humans, sometimes out of desperation and other times out of convenience, but black bears are unlikely to harm people who are just minding their own business. For that reason, bears seemed rather unlikely, but on the other hand, wolves have their own series of issues. Now, there was little doubt that something, most likely a pack of wolves, had consumed the unfortunate camper. Conservation Officer Williams told the Duluth Tribune that there was evidence of wolves in the area, specifically tracks and scat, but it also didn't really seem like they had attacked him while he was in the tent. University of Minnesota researcher Thomas Gable told the Tribune that he was of the opinion that the chance of wolves attacking Jordan was infinitesimally rare, given the tendency of wolves to avoid human beings unless desperate. This is reflected by the total lack of incidences of wolves killing and eating humans in Minnesota going back over 100 years. Gable attributed this unwillingness to attack people to a built-in innate fear of humans, probably through a long relationship with people and learning that people mean trouble and bad news, which he said causes them to avoid humans and our settlements. That said, though he didn't rule out the ability of wolves to kill a person in a hammock, what really stuck out to him was the fact that this campsite was too intact and that there was, shockingly, not enough blood. They're not neat predators, he said, adding that if they make a kill, the scene where the blood and remains are is a huge scene of disturbance, where the blood smears across a large area. This brought him to the conclusion that wolves most likely consumed Grider after he was already dead and outside of the tent. The blood, as far as reporting from both the police and journalists goes, was limited to items inside of the hammock, the interior walls of the tent, one hat found outside the tent, and the sleeping bag cover that was also found outside. Perhaps most importantly, there were no tears whatsoever in the hammock or the tent, which isn't consistent with a wolf attack. If they'd gone for him while he was in the shelter, their teeth would have ripped the thing apart. In addition to those aspects, Grider's handgun was found in his hammock. His Beretta 92 FS was chambered in 9mm, and the standard magazine capacity for that pistol is 15 rounds, with the restricted capacity being 10. The magazine in the gun was loaded with only 12 rounds, which would suggest that he either failed to fully load the magazine or that at some point he had fired 3 rounds. The latter would make sense if he was being attacked or if he was trying to call for help, though those explanations aren't bulletproof either. When the gun was found by investigators, they noted that the safety was engaged, and if he had gone down fighting, he probably would not have taken the time to re-engage the safety after dying. He might do so, however, if he used the gun to try and call for help, as firing off 3 shots is the universal sign of distress in the outdoors. But the problem with that is that no casings were recovered from the scene. With all of that taken into consideration, it seems that if wolves got to him, they did not manage to do it while he was inside of the tent. But if that's the case, where did all the blood come from? Without evidence that Jordan was attacked by animals while he was alive, the next hypothesis would be that he either ended his own life or had accidentally injured himself while whittling or shaving. Investigators pored over his notes, interviewed his family members, and recovered the data from his cell phone in order to determine if he'd expressed any suicidal ideation, but they found nothing to support that conclusion. Rebecca Grider doubted the whittling explanation for much the same reason that she believed he had died the very first night at camp. There were simply no carved figures, sticks, or debris from the process. The shaving explanation, however, seemed like it could possibly make sense. According to the report of St. Louis County Sheriff Sergeant Stephen Borchers, Jordan was known to use a military-style folding knife to shave his beard. He added that Rebecca told him that Jordan keeps his knives very sharp, and she believes this could be a possible explanation, that he may have accidentally severed an artery while shaving. Had he been shaving in his hammock in his tent, it is possible that he could have nicked his carotid, which would have caused him to bleed out in a matter of minutes. As compared to a fully severed artery, a simple nick in the carotid would still cause him to bleed out, with the added effect of blood spraying because of higher pressure at the wound site. This would account for the blood inside of the hammock as well as on the interior of the tent, as well as why it was limited to just those 2 locations. It's a pretty reasonable explanation for how he could have died, and it leaves open the possibility of him getting up out of the hammock and out of the tent after he was injured and before bleeding out. Still, there are some issues with this theory. As Nick from Missing Enigma said in his video on the case, not only were all of Jordan's knives found in his sheaths, but none of them had any traces of blood. On the other hand, he pointed to the strips of cloth found in the area, which Jordan may have cut in an attempt to craft some bandages as he bled. The issue here is, as Nick again points out, it doesn't appear that any of these strips were used as bandages. I'm inclined to agree, as none of the photographed strips appear to be bloody, nor do the police reports describe them as such. So the question there is, why cut these strips for bandages and then not even attempt to use them? Furthermore, it seems very unlikely that he would have gotten no blood on these strips as he cut, since that's a 2-hand job and he would have had blood spraying from his neck. It may seem like I'm nitpicking, but if we take the situation as a whole, it plays out something like this. Jordan decides it's time for a shave, but rather than walking down to the beaver pond just a couple hundred feet away, where he could use the water to see his reflection and to rinse off his face and knife, he chooses to shave in perhaps the most inconvenient location possible, that being lying down in a hammock. He then nicks an artery, climbs out of the tent, and grabs what appears to have been a pair of green pants, or potentially the shredded jacket mentioned in the police report. He then proceeds to clean his knife on something else, because none of the knives are bloody and none of the cloth strips they found had blood on them. And then he somehow manages to avoid bleeding onto the strips of cloth as he cuts them, despite having to use both hands to do so, and again, having blood spraying from his neck. Once he has finished cutting these strips, he uses none of them, sheathes his knife, and proceeds to lie down in the snow to die. Is all of that impossible? Absolutely not, but it certainly is a weird series of choices and coincidences. It doesn't make much sense that he'd choose to shave his face in the hammock, nor that he'd choose to clean the knife off before trying to cut the bandage strips, or that he'd bother to sheath it afterward. It is possible that he managed to use a bandage and that it was carried off with some of his remains by the wolves, but then again, there's the lack of any blood on the strips that remained. Another thing that stuck out to me about these green cloth strips is that if you look at the pictures of where they were found, there is a holster in the midst of them, while the handgun that would have gone in the holster is in the hammock. In addition to that, another 2 of Jordan's magazines were found, one of which, item 37, is described as near camp. If the green strips were from a pair of pants, then it is possible that the holster was attached to them, and therefore it makes sense that that would be near the pants, but the magazine is a little harder to explain. There's also the possibility that this is the jacket that was mentioned as being shredded, in which case the holster is confusing too. But I say the magazine is a little more confusing because magazines aren't light, so even if being shaken out of a pair of pants, it's going to be found pretty close to where it was shaken out of the pants. They're not going to go flying. It could be that it fell out while the wolves were doing their thing, but then again, there is no blood on any of those garments, and also, why was the magazine on his person while the gun was in the hammock? I can't speak for all gun owners, but I don't just casually keep magazines hanging out in my jacket pockets. So, taking all of that evidence into account, none of the animal-inflicted or self-inflicted causes of death seem to be very sturdy, and foul play was ruled out by a lack of evidence. To this day, there is still no official cause of death listed for Jordan Grider, which is not particularly unusual in cases where the majority of a body is not found. He certainly suffered massive bleeding, but outside of that, nobody can ever truly be sure. Authorities have nothing further to go on, so this has sort of been filed under the unprepared camper has a misadventure category. Speaking to Joe Friedrichs, Rick Slatton was clear that the biggest threat to somebody on their trip to the wilderness is themselves, seemingly of the opinion that, whatever it was that caused Jordan's death, it was most likely a result of his own poor judgment. And Slatton isn't wrong to say that Grider was unprepared for this. He had only the bare essentials needed to survive, and didn't appear to have much of a backup plan outside of hiking out should he need to. He had selected an area with limited resources other than wood, and it seemed he'd brought no food that could be eaten without first being prepared over a fire. Put simply, he was tempting fate, and to that end, Slatton said that when they have calls from the Boundary Waters, it usually comes back to either simple forces of nature or choices the individual made while they were out there. But Slatton also said something that surprised me a little bit, because he named the very thing that I first thought of when Nick told me about this story on our live show several months back. Aside from saying that it wasn't wolves and it wasn't bears, Slatton very directly said the Wendigo didn't do it, and I'm not entirely sure that I agree with him on that. A couple of years ago, this video would be openly making the case that a Wendigo is precisely what got Jordan Grider, and that the Forest Service is covering it up in order to keep such a creature secret. Viewers who have been watching this channel for a while probably remember a time where we were much more open to paranormal explanations and government cover-ups of them. But as I've done more and more research, I've found that time and again, the evidence just doesn't support that claim, while those that leave me scratching my head are typically few and far between. And even in those cases where it appears something weird must have happened, the culprit seems most likely to be a human. So you may be asking, what is it that makes this case in particular different? In recent years, the Wendigo has become sort of a cult favorite monster in the paranormal community, and even more so in the era of short-form social media. A Google image search for the term will bring up a slew of pictures depicting an emaciated creature, often humanoid, with the defining characteristic being the rotten or skeletonized skull and antlers of a deer for a head. The same depiction appeared in the 2021 horror film Antlers, which is all I have to say about that film. The TV series Hannibal, which ran for 3 seasons on NBC beginning in 2013 before it was tragically canceled, opted for a more humanoid version, foregoing the deer skull but keeping the antlers. All of these are wrong. The pop culture version of the Wendigo, so common in Hollywood and the general overall body of paranormal fiction, is, for all intents and purposes, a completely different creature from what is described by the Algonquian-speaking tribes with whom it originated. A couple of productions have come close, namely the CW's Supernatural, which featured the monster in its 2nd episode, and the video game Until Dawn, in which the creature is the primary antagonist of the story. In both of these pieces of media, the Wendigo is depicted as being far closer to the traditional version, lacking the animalistic traits entirely, and instead appearing as a gaunt, pale, seemingly rotten human with supernatural abilities such as superior strength and speed. The creature that Sam and Dean take on early in the series Supernatural is a superhuman cannibal, a perfect hunter with the sole desire to feast on human flesh. A skilled ventriloquist, he is able to mimic the voices of his prey and make it sound as though their cries for help are coming from all over the forest. It moves with blinding speed, eviscerating its victims with sharp clawed fingers, or potentially dragging their unconscious body back to its subterranean home in a mine. In the end, the brothers are able to kill it using a flare gun, which quickly lights the creature's papery skin until it is consumed by the flames. For the most part, it's a pretty faithful interpretation, although it's clear that certain liberties were taken in order to make the plot of the episode work. But of course, even in the traditional accounts, there is a degree of variation. There are a number of linguistic and cultural subgroups within the Algonquian family, of which two of the largest are the Anishinaabe and the Cree. These, in turn, have some of the best preserved and most extensive stories about this being, or, more properly, these beings. Essential to understanding what a Wendigo actually is, and why it's relevant to this case, is a deeper understanding of the spiritual beliefs of groups like the Anishinaabe and the Cree. One of the foremost authors on the subject was the Ojibwe scholar and elder Basil H. Johnston, whose work we've cited in prior videos dealing with the concept of the Wendigo, and to whom I looked when trying to craft a better understanding of the supernatural entities known to the Ojibwe and their cousins as Manitous. You may be familiar with the term as it relates to certain locations in the Great Lakes region, such as Manitoulin Island, which is named for the Anishinaabe term, and I'm going to try my best, Maniduwaaling, meaning Cave of the Spirit. Or you may have heard it as part of the term applied to the creator being of Algonquian storytelling, Kichi-Manitou, typically known in English as the Great Spirit. For these reasons, it's understandable that many Westerners have assumed Manitous to be a term for spiritual entities akin to gods or goddesses in European cultures, but this is not quite the case. Manitou, as Johnson explains, is a term that does not fit quite so neatly into the Abrahamic paradigm familiar to European Americans. Even amongst Christians, the spiritual realm of our own religion is typically understood as being a very simple good versus evil, where God and his loyal angels are the side of light, and Satan and his fallen demons are the side of darkness. By and large, that is mainly how it works, but there's a lot of nuance to what angels and demons actually are in Abrahamic theology. It's much the same with the Western understanding of Anishinaabe spirituality. Christians, seeing that the creator being was called Kichi-Manitou, Great Manitou, mistakenly believed that the latter half of the term was a direct translation for spirit. When a medicine person uttered the term Manitou 1 to refer to a curative or healing property in a tree or plant, Johnston continues, they took it to mean spirit. The same was true of other forms of the word, such as Manitou-Wat and Manitou-Wi, which would refer to the sacred atmosphere of a place, or seemingly mystical abilities of a healer, respectively. Put simply, as Johnston wrote in his book, The Manitous, the term refers to realities other than the physical ones of rock, fire, water, air, wood, and flesh, to the unseen realities of individual beings and places and events that are beyond human understanding, but most certainly real. Mysteries, as they might be described. And amongst these were two in particular to be feared, of which the more horrifying appears to have been the Wendigo. So it may be this miscommunication, this misunderstanding of what the term Manitou actually means, that led many non-natives to believe that the Wendigo is a spirit in and of itself, rather than what seems to be described more as a spiritual transformation. If you've seen our previous videos that deal with the topic of the Wendigo, then you've probably heard the following description from Johnston, where he describes the creature as gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones. With bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash gray of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets, the Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody from its constant chewing with jagged teeth. Unclean and suffering from suppuration of the flesh, the Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odor of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. There is, however, more. In addition to the Wendigo being described as rot and decay personified, Johnston also writes that it was a giant Manitou in the form of a man or woman who towered 5 to 8 times above the height of a tall man. It was, however, a giant in height only, a description he explains through selected Wendigo stories included in the chapter. He also says that when one such being hunted, a dark snow cloud would shroud its upper body from the waist up, and the air would turn cold so the trees crackled. Then a wind would rise, no more than a breath at first, but in moments mining and driving, transformed into a blizzard. Following the blizzard, it was said, came the Wendigo. For many, the appearance alone of the Wendigo, or even the blizzard preceding it, was enough to scare them into the grave, as was the case in an eye-pissing tale related by Johnston. In that story, a man described as reasonably successful as any other hunter, whose family fell upon hard times during an unusually hot and dry summer, approached a sorcerer because his family had been reduced to eating roots and bark to survive the winter. It is noted that while everyone else in the village was suffering, only this man sought a supernatural remedy to his woes. To that end, he requested something that would give him the ability to find real food, and was given a powder made of roots with instructions for him to brew it and drink it in the morning. The man followed these instructions, brewing and drinking this beverage before anyone else in the village was awake the next day. And almost at once, the story reads, he began to grow in height until he was 6 times the height of an ordinary man. At first, this is so exciting that the man forgot about his hunger, forgot about his family's hunger, and his legs now being much longer, his muscles much more powerful, he just kind of romps and bounds about in the wilderness, enjoying his newfound abilities. And of course, as part of this, the author notes that he would be able to outrun most large animals, and therefore was very capable of hunting any game that he might come across. Soon, however, the man was tired from running about in the forest and took a moment to rest. As he did so, he became very conscious of his hunger, but strangely found that the thought of animal flesh sickened him. In his efforts to remedy this peculiar, indescribable craving, he stood once more to go off in search of food. After some time, he crests over a hill, and off in the distance, he sees a village, and he decides, okay, I'm gonna go down there, and maybe they'll have some food for me. As he neared the village, it said that he called out a greeting, but that just the visage of the Wendigo alone frightened most of the people living there straight into the grave. They just keeled over dead. Those that did survive ran off into the wilderness, and we don't really hear about what happens to them, but it seems they were never seen again. So, as this man entered the village, he found that there were plentiful stores of actual food, including meat. But there was also this abundance of humans, and he had, as we might call it, the hunger. Though it hadn't been his intention to kill everybody in the village and then consume their dead bodies, he did realize that there was the situation gave him exactly what he really wanted deep down, and he began to just feast on the entire bodies, just picking them up and dropping them right in the gullet. Strangely, however, as he did so, his hunger did not diminish. Instead, he grew in proportion to each meal, leaving him just as hungry as before, if not more so. It is only at this point in the story that the man is first referred to as a Wendigo, the transformation apparently being cemented by the decision to eat human flesh when other options were available. The story ends when a man of that village, who was not present when the Wendigo came through, tracks the creature down across hundreds of miles, eventually finding it shrunken to the normal stature of an ordinary Wendigo. What exactly that means is hard to say, because earlier in that chapter, Johnston describes these beings as giants, and yet this normal-sized man is able to club one of the weakened Wendigos to death. In that story, it is the act of cannibalism, not just the desire to eat human flesh, undertaken out of greed or gluttony, that causes the transformation from human into Wendigo. But this is not the only way for someone to become such a monster. In the second story provided by Johnston, a man with many wives asked a couple to take their daughter as yet another. They refused him, the father pointing out that the petitioner had already had several wives, more wives than most men, and should not take another lest one of the wives be neglected. In addition, he bid the man think of the other men who did not yet have wives. But, rather than seeing the logic behind the father's words, the suitor took this as an insult. And as one does when told that he cannot take yet another wife, he turned to magic to get what he wanted. As the story goes, he made an effigy of this girl that he wanted to marry out of snow, then immersed it in water, then left it outside to freeze solid overnight. Then he buried the effigy in ashes while performing ritual chants, which in turn caused the girl to feel a chill all throughout her body. It was a chill, Johnston writes, that numbed her entire being and made her unbelievably hungry, which was strange because she and her family had just eaten a short time earlier. No matter what was done, the girl could not be warmed, nor could her hunger be sated, and at last she turned on her family. With a strength born out of desperation, she killed them all and ate every last one. At that time, they had been camping out on their trap line, and when they did not return, the rest of the village took notice, and the sorcerer himself volunteered to go and be the search party. It said that he did this because the tribal custom would mean that he, as rescuer, with her entire family now dead, would be able to claim her as a wife. Upon the sorcerer's arrival, it said that the girl was in a daze, unable to recall what had become of her family, of whom, other than a few of their possessions, there was no trace. But her hunger had subsided, and she went meekly with her rescuer. As one might expect, the girl's father had been completely correct in saying that bringing yet another wife into this household might cause friction with the other wives. And as a result, the girl never really managed to fit in amongst the other women of the household. Along with the issue of jealousy, they were also a little suspicious about how her entire family had disappeared, and yet she was left alive, yet they would not tell her why they were suspicious. Eventually, at the urging of one of the older wives, she confronted the man who bewitched her and learned the truth. Then, in despair and anger, and with both unnatural chill and insatiable hunger settling in once more, she made a bonfire and threw herself into it. The story says that everybody was horrified to watch this happen, but that the girl didn't even make a sound as she went into the flames. It was just the sounds of burning flesh. Then, once the fire had finally died down and they began to sift through the ashes, searching for her remains in order to give her a proper burial, all they found were two little icy figurines. One depicted a woman encased in ice, and the other an infant. As it turned out, this wife, this young woman who had been turned into a Wendigo so that she could be claimed by the sorcerer, had been pregnant with his unborn child, and this was a way of her getting revenge. The remaining two stories included in the chapter deal more with the death of a Wendigo than the creation of such a thing. In the first, the Anishinaabe cultural hero Nanabauzu was captured by one of the cannibals in, you guessed it, Minnesota. The monster commanded the hero to build the very fire and spit that would be used to cook his flesh, and was told that if he refused to do so, or he tried to escape, he would instead be eaten alive. So, as Nanabauzu worked to build the fire, a mouse asked why he didn't just kill the thing, and Nanabauzu replied that he would do so if he only knew how. The mouse then gave him one of the funniest methods of killing a monster that I have ever read. As instructed, the story reads, Nanabauzu found a long dry staff, hard and stiff with age, and thrust one end into the white-hot coals as a blacksmith does when he tempers metal. Once the point of the staff burned white and red, he withdrew it from the fire and retreated a little from where the Wendigo was sleeping on his stomach with his rump upraised like a hillock. Then, from about 100 paces away, Nanabauzu threw the makeshift javelin. His target was the very middle of the Wendigo's rump, Johnston writes, and his aim was dead on. The cannibal screamed in pain and ran off into the forest, and from that point on, the Anishinaabe of Minnesota were no longer troubled by Wendigos for fear of Nanabauzu and his methods. The final story, and the second involving Nanabauzu, takes place in Nipissing territory. This time, however, there is not just one Wendigo, and they've been terrorizing the Nipissing for years. The hero, called upon by these victims who heard of his exploits of the previous tale, bravely answered, but under the impression that there was only one Wendigo. So when he arrives, he hails the monster, come out and fight me, and then much to his shock, not just one Wendigo emerges from the forest, not two, not three, but over 3 dozen. Nanabauzu did the sensible thing, which is he turned tail and ran all the way to the lake, and then not only into the lake, but actually onto the lake, as stones miraculously rose up to meet his feet. The Wendigos, of course, follow Nanabauzu all the way down to the lake and then across the stepping stones until all 40 of them are over the water, at which point the stones just vanish back under the waves, and the Wendigos realize they can't swim. So all 40 of the Wendigos just drown. Right then and there, Nanabauzu is hailed as a great hero, and there is never again a worry of Wendigos at this lake. All in all, Johnston's accounting of the Wendigo gives us several important pieces of information. First of all, there are multiple ways to make a Wendigo, and also multiple ways to bring about their end. Consistent with most people's understanding today, they can be killed by fire, but they can also be clubbed to death or drowned, among other things. We're also informed that the craving for human flesh is not what makes somebody a Wendigo, but rather the actual act of consuming the body of another person, typically out of greed or some other self-serving interest, and that arrogance or impetuousness can be their downfall. These traits seem to be consistent across tribal lines within the Algonquian community, with the exception of them being giants. Looking at Johnston's own set of stories, only in one is the Wendigo described as being larger than an average man. Now, it could be that cultural context baked the size disparity into the story itself, much the same way that we don't need to describe Goliath from the Bible as being large. But there are aspects of these stories that suggest this is not the case. In the first narrative, for example, the Wendigo is killed by a normal-sized human being with a club. It's said that the monster had shrunk to the size of a normal Wendigo, but earlier in the chapter, Johnston said that a normal Wendigo was 5 to 8 times the size of a man. It seems rather unlikely that a human hunter standing less than 6 feet tall could take down a 30 to 50 foot tall giant without something a little bit more powerful than a wooden club. In the second narrative, it's even more plain that the giant aspect is not necessarily a ubiquitous trait, as nobody seems to realize that the girl is a Wendigo. Surely, had she suddenly grown to be 5 times her original height when she was rescued, somebody would have caught on. Since nobody did, it can be inferred that there was no physical change. The issue is actually consistent across Ojibwe accounts, where the Wendigo is referred to as a giant, but described in ways that don't seem to match with that terminology. Several such examples are provided in the 30th Annual Archaeological Report submitted to the Minister of Education for the province of Ontario in 1918. There are several different storytellers cited, all of them Ojibwe, but the primary two are Mrs. Sampson Ingersoll and Lottie Marsden, whose native names were Puluamuk and Chicocqua. Puluamuk and Chicocqua. I'm trying my best. If you happen to know how these names should be pronounced, I've used them several times now. Feel free to correct me. I really would like to know how to do this. Now, Ingersoll's story is particularly interesting because in this case, the Wendigo actually has a brother who is not a Wendigo, but does live with him. Now, the Wendigo in this story is described as being big, but no specific measurements are given, and the non-cannibal brother is able to defeat him in a wrestling match. Looking at Marsden's stories, both of them do refer to the Wendigo as being a giant. The term giant is used in the text, but once again, the other aspects of the story do not support that title. As both are rather short, I'm just going to read them in full. Aiden, the mood lighting. Perfect. One time long ago, a big Wendigo stole an Indian boy, but the boy was too thin, so the Wendigo didn't eat him up right away. But he traveled with the Indian boy, waiting for him till he'd get fat. The Wendigo had a knife, and he'd cut the boy on the hand to see if he was fat enough to eat, but the boy didn't get fat. They traveled too much. One day, they came to an Indian village, and the Wendigo sent the boy to the Indian village to get some things for him to eat. He just gave the boy so much time to go there and back. The boy told the Indians that the Wendigo was near them, and showed them his hand where the Wendigo cut him to see if he was fat enough to eat. They heard the Wendigo calling the boy. He said to the boy, "Hurry up, don't tell lies to those Indians." All of these Indians went to where the Wendigo was and cut off his legs. They went back to see if he was dead. He wasn't dead. He was eating the juice, marrow, from the inside of the bones of his legs that were cut off. The Indians asked the Wendigo if there was any fat on them. He said, "You bet there is. I have eaten lots of Indians. No wonder they are fat." The Indians then killed him and cut him to pieces. The end of this giant Wendigo. The second story reads as follows. A long time ago, an Indian was hunting. He was in a very wild place where nobody would be near. He saw a foot track, a very big foot track, and he followed the track for a long ways off until he came to a clearance. He saw a camp not far away, and he thought to himself, "I will go there and look for something to eat." So he went and rapped at the door. A woman came out and said to the hunter, "Why do you come here? For this is where the Wendigo lives." "Well, I am very hungry," said the hunter to the giant's wife. "Well, he will kill you for sure. Go away. He will soon be back now." "Well, give me something to eat right away, and I will hide under the chair when he comes so he won't see me." The Indian asked the Wendigo's wife, "What does he generally ask you to do for him when he comes?" "Well, he asks me to scratch him all over his body." "Well, you ask him where he's got the sorest spot." Well, the hunter hid under the chair, and the Wendigo came in. He said, "I smell some fresh meat." His wife says to him, "It must be the meat you've got with you. What did you bring today?" Well, the Wendigo had his supper, and after his supper, he asked his wife to scratch him all over his body again. She asked him, where had he the sorest spot? He said, "Between my shoulders." The Indian hunter got up and hit him where he had the sorest spot with his little axe. The Wendigo's wife was very glad that the Wendigo was killed, for she was always afraid of him herself. She then lived with the Indian hunter. They lived there for a long time. The end of the giant Wendigo. Going through this again with a new set of eyes a whole year after doing our Wendigo versus Wachuge video, I'm realizing there's actually a lot more similarities between these two things, and it's messing with my head a little bit because two very different cultures. In any case, in all three stories, the context suggests that giant is not necessarily understood to mean that the Wendigo is a towering monstrosity dozens of feet tall. In one of the stories, the Wendigo is killed by a normal human hunter with a club. In another, the Wendigo's brother, who is presumably human because he's not described as anything else, is able to beat the Wendigo in a wrestling match. In yet another one of the stories, a group of warriors from a village are able to beat him with, given what we know about Native American culture and history, could have been no more than stone axes. And in the last one, the Wendigo is not only able to fit into a human habitation, a home of some kind, but he's also able to be killed with a single axe stroke to the back. None of these narratives seem to support the idea that the Wendigo is extraordinarily tall, but almost seem to imply that it is just large enough to be considered out of the ordinary. The answer to the conundrum of Wendigo gigantism may lie in comparing the Ojibwe and other Anishinaabe source material to that of the Cree, who American anthropologist Robert Brightman noted conventionally figure the Wendigo as possessing normal human dimensions. In his 1988 article, The Wendigo in the Material World, Brightman analyzed a number of scholarly works on the subject, as well as accounts from explorers and missionaries in the pre-scholarship period of the field. One such source of the latter variety was the 1809 book Travels in Canada and the Indian Territories by the American fur trader Alexander Henry, whose work we've cited in prior videos on both the Wendigo and Sasquatch. During his travels, Alexander Henry lived amongst the Ottawa, a very closely related tribe to the Ojibwe and part of the Anishinaabe cultural umbrella. During the winter of 1763 to 1764, he and a group of native companions had just traveled to Lake Superior from Sault Ste. Marie. I know I pronounced that wrong. It's French. I don't care. I don't care if I pronounce French wrong. If they want me to pronounce the words correctly, they should write them in English. Nobody speaks your language anymore. The future is now, old man. Anyway, the area was in the midst of a famine, and Henry and his companions had been informed that they might find fish at a place called Oak Bay, which is now it's Goulet Bay, I guess? Goulash Bay, for all I care. Anyway, it's on the map. Now, while they were encamped there, a young man came straggling out of the woods, and something about him immediately put Henry's Ottawa companions on edge. Henry wrote that the appearance of this youth was frightful, and from his squalid figure there issued a stench which none of us could support. He continued on to say that the man's arrival struck our camp with horror and uneasiness, and it was not long before the Indians came to me, saying that they suspected he had been eating human flesh, and even that he had killed and devoured the family which he pretended to leave behind. The man obviously denied it, claiming that he had left the family to which he longed behind in a starving condition and unable from their weakly and exhausted state to pursue their journey to the bay. This did not assuage the doubts of the others, who instead elected to follow the man's tracks back and determine what the truth was for themselves. What they found confirmed their suspicions. A campsite, about a day's journey back, where they found a hand left to roast by a fire, intestines hung upon a tree, and a human skull. The young man, at this point, having been found out, confessed and admitted that he had killed and eaten his family with the assistance of a cousin. According to Henry, it appeared that the family had consisted of his uncle and aunt, their 4 children, and himself. One of the children was a boy 15 years of age. His uncle, after firing at several beasts of the chase, all of which he missed, fell into despondence and persuaded himself that it was the will of the Great Spirit that he should perish. In this state of mind, he requested his wife to kill him. The woman refused to comply, but the 2 lads, one of them, as has been said, the nephew, and the other, the son of the unhappy man, agreed between themselves to murder him to prevent, as our informant wished us to believe, his murdering them. Accomplishing their detestable purpose, they devoured the body. And famine pressing upon them still closer, they successively killed the 3 younger children, upon whose flesh they subsisted for some time, and with a part of which the parricides at length set out for the lake, leaving the woman, who was too feeble to travel, to her fate. On their way, their foul victuals failed, the youth before us killed his companion, and it was part of the remains of his last victim that had been discovered at the fire. Even with this admission, and with their opinion that the man, who has once made human flesh his food, will never afterward be satisfied with any other, they gave the man a chance to prove that he was no Wendigo, only to find that he ate with relish nothing that was given to him, but, indifferent to the food prepared, fixed his eyes continually on the children who were in the Indian lodge, commenting frequently on how fat they all looked. Henry gave this young man the benefit of the doubt, considering that it was possible he was just happy for the children, and that they were not starving. The Ottawa gave no such quarter. Concerned that the man was going to strike out after their own children, they waited until he was, not paying attention, walked up behind him, and gave him one axe blow to the back of the head. Now, Henry's story is not unique, nor is it a folktale. He watched this happen with his own eyes, and this can tell us quite a bit about the way that members of the Anishinaabe community and culture conceived of the Wendigo. This young man was no giant, he didn't have any supernatural abilities, he was just a starving person driven mad by desperation. But they considered him a Wendigo all the same, even if his condition was entirely psychological and did not manifest in any physical change. Going back to Brightman's work, he traced the etymology and use of the term itself in various forms across the different Algonquian languages, noting that perhaps the earliest textual use of this term may come from William Strachey's 1612 work, History of Travel into Virginia Britannia, which is a funny title for a book written less than 30 years after the first attempted colonization of that area. Either way, Strachey's book has a dictionary of Powhatan terms, which includes the word wintook, which he defined in 17th century English as a fool. While today we use the word fool to refer to stupidity or gullibility, it was often used to refer to people who were perceived as utterly senseless or insane during the early modern period. It would be entirely reasonable that a matching term in the Algonquian language family would be used to describe a cannibal, as eating human flesh was and still is considered to be the behavior of somebody who is completely out of their mind. Moving away from Brightman's work, however, and into a more general story, there is another historical example that I think might be relevant here. It's also a story that once again highlights the utter incompetence and ineptitude of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Anyway, what I want to do is briefly go over the story of Jack Fiddler, a shaman and chief of the Sucker clan of northwestern Ontario's Sandy Lake. Fiddler, whose native name I absolutely cannot pronounce but means he who stands in the southern sky, was well known in his community as a Wendigo slayer. Now, according to all known accounts, he was not going around just randomly murdering people and then saying that they were Wendigos afterwards. Rather, he was called upon by families to more humanely euthanize people they believed were going to turn into a Wendigo. But according to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, in 1906, word reached the Royal Northwest Mounted Police of a band of pagan Indians who are in the habit of killing one another whenever one gets delirious through fever or other causes. Naturally, on an occasion where they actually weren't asked to investigate, they for once bothered to do so. The result was that in 1907, a detachment of the RCNWP was sent to a village that had never actually been informed they were under Canadian authority, nor had Canadian laws been explained to them. As one may expect, these wonderful Mounties ignored any sense of nuance to the situation, didn't even try to understand what was going on, or why the people of Sandy Lake thought that this was okay, and promptly arrested Jack and his brother Joseph for murder. These two men, who were not in any way aware that they were even subject to the Canadian judicial system, were to be tried without a lawyer, hundreds of miles from home, with essentially zero character witnesses present, due to the Canadian authorities just not offering transport or properly informing their community of what was going on. Now, Jack Fiddler actually managed to escape custody and opted to take his own life out in the forest. His brother Joseph, however, did go to trial. At trial, despite the pleas of his own people, Methodist missionaries, Canadian fur trappers, and even the jury itself, Joseph was sentenced to death because, in the words of Royal Northwestern Mounted Police Commissioner Aylesworth Bowen Perry, what the law forbids, no pagan belief can justify. Now, it should be pointed out that there were Christian missionaries arguing on this guy's behalf. So it's not just pagan beliefs here, it's just this guy. In the end, appeals on Joseph's behalf were actually successful, but he died of tuberculosis while imprisoned in Manitoba. As I have been saying, there is truly no such thing as too low for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. But you may be asking, what does any of this have to do with the death of Jordan Grider? Well, let's summarize what we know about his situation. Most of his body has never been recovered and is assumed to have been eaten by wolves, but only after he was outside of the tent. He appears to have been in his hammock when whatever fatal wound he received occurred, and the blood spatter on the tarp itself would suggest that a major artery, likely in the neck, was nicked or severed, resulting in a bleed out. As we established, all of his knives were found sheathed, none of them were bloody, and it makes very little sense to attempt to shave while lying down in a hammock of all places. However, if someone were to find him out there, sneak up while he was sleeping, and cut his throat, well then suddenly everything makes sense, doesn't it? The question, of course, would be, well, what motive would somebody have to track this man out into the woods, kill him, and then take none of his possessions? Well, if the motive is cannibalism, then everything is consistent. Is it far-fetched? Absolutely. But so are the other possibilities, and in this case, we actually have centuries of both documented history and folktales alluding to the presence of cannibals who live out in the wild and stalk people in the winter in this exact area. That said, I don't think it's by any means a concrete fact that Jordan Grider was the victim of a Wendigo, be it the more monstrous folklore version or the kind described by Alexander Henry that he encountered during the winter of 1763. It is, however, by far the closest thing I've seen to such an occurrence in the dozens of cases I've reviewed, and it brings us to a peculiar consideration. If this is best described as a Wendigo attack, and Wendigos are just humans with a taste for their fellow man, then are we not just looking at a potential serial killer? Have we found a crossroads between legend and reality, and if we have, was I right all along in saying that the Wendigo is responsible for some missing 411 disappearances? I'd love to know what you guys think, so please let us know in the comments, and of course, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, share it with your friends, let people know that we do this. I also want to give a huge shout out and thank you to The Missing Enigma for helping us with this video by providing those documents. I do greatly appreciate it, and once again, I just love this community for being so forthcoming and willing to share. With all of that said, if you want to support what we do here at the Lore Lodge, then the very first thing you can do is go to bunkerbranding.com and get yourself a new hoodie. See it? Isn't it pretty? It's got our logo on it. It's also the comfiest hoodie I own by far. We have hoodies in both the new logo right here, which comes on the dark blue, and then we have the old logo on black. In addition to the hoodies, we also have both of those designs as t-shirts as well as a couple others. So if you're interested in picking one of these up, go over to bunkerbranding.com, find the Lore Lodge, and do so. If you're not so into wearing the lodge and would prefer to consume the lodge, you can do so by going to tableauroastingco.com and getting our coffee Mount Pocono perk under the collaborations tab, where you will see it next to the Lewis and Dark roast, sold by Stakuyi. I would like to use that opportunity to tell you that we are launching a brand new history podcast with Stephen Bell from History of Everything, Stakuyi channel, all of that, as well as Roman Helmet Guy from TikTok. The next most important thing I should tell you is that if you are interested in getting updates on what we've got going on, new releases from merch, things like that, you should follow our Discord. It is bit.ly/jointhelodge. You will also find links for all of these things in the description. If you're looking for more Lodge, then as I mentioned, we have a new podcast coming with Steven and Roman Helmet Guy, but we also have several other channels already. We have, that one is going to be taking over a channel we currently have called The History Hut, by the way, so go ahead, head over there, subscribe to it. Hey, if you guys watch that video, the sooner it gets monetized, the better we can do on that show. So if you guys want to watch the videos that are currently there, go ahead and do so. There's even a couple of podcasts already that are Steven and I. But in addition to that, we already have the Weird Bible podcast that we do with Wendigo. That is a show about Christianity, but not a show that is preaching Christianity. It's a show where you get to learn about it the same way you would learn about any other belief system. And of course, it being called the Weird Bible, we focus on the weird supernatural aspects of the book that are often poorly understood in church. We of course also have our live show, which is every Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern, unless it isn't, and we always let you know if it won't be. If you can't make the show live, it is of course viewable here on YouTube at all times for eternity, because the internet is forever, but you can also catch it on Spotify and any other podcast platform from your phone. With all of that said, I am Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.